The desert wind screamed like something alive. Private Karl Weber pressed his face into the sand as the air around him erupted in dust and fire. The sun over Tunisia burned white, but the light that blinded him now came from explosions, not heaven. His ears rang. His rifle lay somewhere out of reach. "Zurückziehen! Pull back!" Sergeant Mueller shouted over the roar, waving his arm, but no one was left to command. The Africa Corps line had collapsed. American tanks crawled over the dunes, cutting off their retreat like predators circling a wounded prey. Karl lifted his head and saw the black smoke rising where their half-tracks had been. The world smelled of burning oil and fear. A bullet cracked past his ear, and instinct forced him flat again. He tasted grit and blood. Hours earlier, he'd believed in victory. The German radio said Rommel would regroup, that supply lines would be restored, that the desert belonged to the Reich, but the desert belonged to no one. A voice shouted nearby in English. Karl understood only fragments. "Drop it! Hands up!" He looked toward the sound and froze. An American soldier stood atop the ridge, helmet glinting, rifle steady. Behind him came others, moving fast, their uniforms brown and dusty. Mueller fired once, then twice. The American dropped to one knee but didn't fall. Another burst of fire answered, short, professional, final. Mueller fell backward, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Karl's hands moved on their own. His rifle clattered into the sand. He raised both arms slowly, palms open to the sky. The Americans surrounded him, shouting orders. "Get up! Move! Over there!" He obeyed, stumbling toward a group of other captured men, maybe 20 of them, dazed, sunburned, some wounded. One of the GIs looked at Karl and muttered, "Kids. They're just kids." Karl wanted to protest he was 23, but the word hit harder than any bullet. Kids, not soldiers. By evening, they were herded into the back of a truck, wrists tied loosely with rope. The engine rumbled to life, carrying them away from the front lines. Karl turned for one last look at the horizon. The desert stretched endlessly behind him, golden and cruel. Somewhere out there lay Rommel's shattered army ghosts, scattered by the wind. Inside the truck, the prisoners sat in silence. The man beside Karl whispered prayers. Another, a corporal with a broken nose, muttered, "They'll shoot us. You'll see. The Americans don't take prisoners." But the soldiers guarding them looked almost bored. One chewed gum, another smoked. Their faces weren't hateful, just tired. Karl couldn't understand it. He'd been taught the Americans were brutal, godless men. Yet these looked as ordinary as anyone he'd known in Munich. When the truck stopped at a makeshift camp, the Germans were lined up, searched, and handed canteens of water. One guard motioned for Karl to drink. Suspicious, he hesitated, but thirst won. The water was cool and clean. "Danke," Karl muttered. The guard grinned. "You're welcome, Fritz." That night, Karl lay on the ground beneath a blanket that wasn't his. The desert stars burned above him, sharp and infinite. He listened to distant engines, to someone crying softly in the dark. For the first time since joining the army, he felt not proud, not angry, just small. 2 days later, the prisoners were marched to a coastal base where American ships waited. Rumor spread that they were being sent to England, maybe Canada. No one mentioned America that was too far, too impossible. As they boarded the transport ship, Karl caught a glimpse of his reflection in the steel hull. Gaunt, filthy, eyes hollow, a stranger stared back. The ship smelled of diesel and salt. Guards watched them closely, but not cruelly. They were given food, real food. Bread, beans, coffee, hot coffee. Karl burned his tongue on the first sip but couldn't stop drinking. Around him, the other prisoners whispered in disbelief. "Are we dreaming?" one asked. "Don't trust it," another said. "It's just to make us talk." But no one questioned the warmth of the meal. Hunger silenced suspicion. On deck, the sea stretched endless and blue. For men who had lived months in sand, the sight was a miracle. Karl leaned on the railing, wind on his face, and thought of home, of his mother's kitchen, his sister's laughter before the war. He had almost forgotten the sound. An American sailor walked past, humming a tune. It was slow, mournful, something about Tennessee. Karl didn't understand the words, but the melody felt kind. Days blurred into nights. The prisoners were allowed brief walks on deck, always under watch. Some talked with guards through broken English or hand gestures. Others stayed silent, afraid of being tricked. One afternoon, a storm hit. The sea rose in angry walls of water. Men vomited, prayed, cursed. The guards struggled alongside them, shouting over the wind. When a prisoner slipped near the railing, an American grabbed him by the arm and hauled him back without hesitation. "Easy, buddy. Don't go swimming." Karl watched, stunned. The man had risked his life for an enemy. After the storm passed, the air turned calm again. The ocean glittered like polished glass. At sunset, the sky flamed red and gold. Karl stood alone on deck, feeling the strange peace of captivity. He had stopped counting the days when the coastline appeared faint at first, then growing sharper. Not England, not France, something different. "America," someone whispered. The word passed through the crowd like wind through dry leaves. America. They had crossed the ocean not as conquerors, but as prisoners. The ship entered a vast harbor. Karl saw cranes, warehouses, distant bridges stretching into the horizon. On the docks, soldiers waited in rows. Behind them, civilians gathered to watch men, women, even children waving small flags. The German prisoners stared in disbelief. They expected hatred. Instead, they saw curiosity. As they disembarked, the Americans handed out sandwiches and apples. Karl took one, confused. "For us?" he asked in broken English. A sergeant smiled. "You're our guests now." "Guests," Karl repeated, the word tasting unreal. Trucks waited to carry them inland. As Karl climbed aboard, he saw the city skyline rising behind him, a forest of steel and glass shining in the sun. New York, someone said. To Karl, it looked like another planet. The convoy moved through the streets. Civilians lined the sidewalks to watch. Some jeered, others waved. One woman threw a flower at the truck, not in anger, but almost in pity. Karl caught it in his hands. The petals were red, soft, impossibly alive. He looked at the guard beside him, a young American about his age. The guard nodded once, as if to say, "You made it, kid." Karl didn't know whether to smile or cry. That night, as they reached the train station that would take them to the POW camp, the prisoners were given blankets again. Not rags, but wool clean, folded. A simple act that broke something inside him. He lay awake in the train car, the rhythm of the wheels echoing in his chest. All his life, he'd believed the Reich stories, that the enemy was savage, inhuman. But here he was, alive, fed, treated with dignity by the men he was told were monsters. For the first time since the war began, Karl didn't know who the enemy truly was. Outside, the American countryside blurred past endless fields under a full moon. A land untouched by bombs. A land that felt, impossibly, like peace. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, not for victory, not for escape, but for understanding. And somewhere deep inside him, a wall began to crack. The engines never stopped. For 10 endless days, the ship groaned through the Atlantic, its steel belly filled with captured men who no longer knew what they were supposed to believe. Above deck, gulls followed like white ghosts. Below, hundreds of German soldiers tried to guess where the current was carrying them. Private Karl Weber slept in a hammock strung between pipes that smelled of oil. The air was thick with sweat and rust, but at least it was air alive, moving, not the choking dust of Africa. Every few hours, a guard would open the hatch, letting a shaft of light slice through the dark hold. Each time it appeared, men lifted their heads instinctively, as if sunlight were proof that the world still existed. They ate twice a day: bread, beans, watery soup, sometimes a slice of fruit. To men who had been rationed to crusts and hope, It felt like feast. Some murmured thanks before eating. Others looked at the food suspiciously, as though kindness itself might be a trick. On the fourth day, Karl met an American sailor named Frank Carter. Frank had a face weathered by salt and humor. His accent rolled like waves. He was one of the guards assigned to the prisoner deck, but he didn't carry his rifle with menace, he carried it like habit. "You boys ever seen snow?" he asked one afternoon. Squatting near the railing, while Karl and two others took their 15-minute air break, Karl hesitated. "Yes, in Bavaria." Frank grinned. "Good. You're gonna see a lot more of it where you're going." "Where?" "Can't tell you. Orders." He winked. "But there's plenty of corn and cows." Karl traded a confused glance with his comrade Otto. Cows? Corn? It sounded like paradise compared to minefields and mortars. When the sailors brought water barrels down, Frank always made sure the prisoners closest to collapse drank first. One evening, Karl offered him his own ration of bread as thanks. Frank shook his head. "Keep it, kid. You'll need it where you're going. America's big, but it ain't heaven." That night, the ocean turned wild. Waves slammed against the hull like cannon fire. Men clutched at rails and prayed. Somewhere in the dark, someone began to sing a soft, trembling tune from the Rhineland. The melody spread slowly, 100 voices rising out of fear, blending with the howl of the wind. Karl closed his eyes. The song was about home, about rivers and mothers and the color of autumn leaves. For a moment, he forgot that every man singing was a defeated soldier. They were just men crossing water, suspended between the life behind them and the one ahead. When the storm broke, the sky cleared into a sweep of stars so vast it seemed the ship was floating through heaven. Frank came down again, dripping rainwater. "Lucky bunch," he said. "Whole Atlantic wants you gone, but she let you pass." Karl managed a small smile. "Maybe she pities us." Frank lit a cigarette and stared out at the horizon. Maybe she pities everyone. Days blended. Guards started letting the prisoners line up for brief deck walks twice a day. They had to keep their hands visible and wear white armbands, but the air tasted of salt and freedom. Karl learned bits of English, thank you, bread, good morning. The Americans laughed gently when he mispronounced words, correcting him with patience that unsettled him more than any threat could have. One morning a rumor raced through the hold. They were approaching land. Men pressed against the portholes, peering through fog for any sign. The first to shout was Otto. "Land! Dvorne there!" Karl pushed forward. Between curtains of mist, a shadow rose from the sea at first, just a blur, then cliffs, then lights, then shapes that didn't belong to war at all. Buildings, piers. Smoke from factories that meant work, not destruction. A hush fell. Even the guards looked awed. The loudspeaker crackled. "All hands prepare for docking." Prisoners remained seated. Frank leaned over the rail and whistled. "Welcome to New York, gentlemen." The name hit Karl like a storybook title. He'd seen it on maps, heard it whispered by propaganda officers as the home of decadence and chaos. But as the fog thinned, he saw a skyline like something built by God's towers stabbing the clouds, bridges stretching like iron wings. He wasn't sure whether to be afraid or amazed. When the ship finally docked, harbor sounds filled the air, cranes, horns, distant music. Civilians gathered along the fences to stare at the Germans being herded onto the pier. Some jeered. Most just watched, curious. A few waved tentatively, as if unsure whether pity was allowed. Karl felt dozens of eyes on him as he stepped onto American soil. The planks under his boots felt solid in a way he hadn't felt in years. He expected soldiers barking orders, fists, or rifle butts. Instead, he saw order, calm, even care. At the end of the dock, an officer in a clean uniform checked a clipboard. Line 'em up, move 'em to the trains, treat any wounded before transport. Medics, American medics, moved among them with water and bandages. One paused before Karl, pointing to his cracked lip. "You need that cleaned." Karl shook his head quickly. Nine. I am fine." The medic shrugged, handed him a small packet of powder. For infection, mix with water. Karl held it like treasure. The train waiting beyond the docks was unlike anything he'd seen. Polished cars, windows intact, soldiers standing easy instead of tense. When they climbed aboard, each prisoner found a seat, not chains, not cells, but cushioned seats. Food parcels waited on the racks, sandwiches, apples, even small chocolate bars labeled Hershey. Otto picked one up suspiciously. They feed prisoners like this? Karl had no answer. As the train pulled out, the city unfolded beyond the glass streets, buzzing with cars, neon lights, blinking in English words he couldn't read. People walked dogs, carried groceries, laughed openly. There were no air raid sirens, no rubble, no fear in their eyes. He whispered to himself, "So this is what peace looks like." The countryside soon swallowed the skyline. They passed fields, rivers, towns with white-painted churches. Every now and then, children stood near crossings, waving as the train thundered past. The gesture confused the Germans most of all. "They wave to us," Otto muttered. "Do they not know who we are?" Karl watched the children's faces press against the windows of their parents' cars. Maybe they don't care. Night fell. Guards moved down the aisles, collecting wrappers and checking head counts. Frank appeared again, carrying a thermos. "Coffee?" he asked, pouring steaming liquid into tin cups and handing them out. Karl accepted his cautiously. The warmth spread through his fingers. "Thank you," he said in English. Frank smiled. "See? You're getting good at it." Karl hesitated, then asked, "Why you kind to us?" The American shrugged. "War's over for you, son. No point fighting ghosts." Karl looked out the window again. In the dark reflection, his own eyes stared back. Eyes that no longer belonged to a soldier certain of his cause. By morning, they reached the heartland. Rolling plains stretched endlessly under a pale sky. The air smelled of grass and rain. When the train slowed near a small town, locals gathered along the tracks. Some held flags, others just watched in wonder. To them, the Germans were as exotic as creatures from a faraway world. Karl caught sight of a young woman standing with a basket of flowers. She raised her hand, hesitant, then tossed one toward the train. It landed against the glass and slid down slowly, leaving a smear of petals. For reasons he couldn't name, his throat tightened. Hours later, the train stopped beside a sprawling compound surrounded by barbed wire. Beyond the fence stretched neat rows of wooden barracks, watchtowers, and open fields dotted with crops. A sign read, "U.S. Army Prisoner of War, Camp No. 27, Texas." Texas. He repeated the word silently, tasting its strangeness. The prisoners disembarked under the blazing sun. The heat was different from Africa, thick, humid, alive with insects. Guards guided them into lines, counted them, issued ID tags. One officer, older and calm, addressed them through an interpreter. "You are prisoners of war. You will work, you will eat, you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. No one will harm you unless you try to escape." A murmur rippled through the ranks. Some laughed nervously. Others looked ready to collapse from relief. Karl listened, stunned. Geneva Convention. The phrase felt like something from another planet. They were assigned barracks, long wooden huts smelling of pine and fresh paint. Inside were bunks, clean mattresses, even electric lights. Dinner that evening was stew and bread. Music drifted from a nearby guardhouse, swing tunes that seemed to dance over the fences. Lying in his bunk, Karl stared at the ceiling beams glowing under the bulb. "America," he whispered. The word felt enormous, endless, safe. Otto rolled onto his side. "Do you think they'll let us write home?" "They said so." "What will you tell them?" Karl thought for a long moment. "That I am alive, and that the world is not what we were told." Outside, the Texas night hummed with crickets. A guard somewhere strummed a guitar, his voice carrying softly over the compound. The melody was foreign, yet gentle. Karl closed his eyes, listening. He had expected chains, punishment, maybe even death. Instead, he found music, mercy, and a mystery that unsettled him more deeply than hatred ever could. The next morning, as sunlight spilled across the camp, the men awoke to the scent of coffee and bread. A sign hung outside the mess hall. "Work is dignity." It was written in both English and German. Karl touched the paper crane of his own folded hope, the feeling that perhaps captivity could teach freedom. For the first time since the war began, he smiled without fear. The morning light came early in Texas. It poured through the thin windows of the barracks and painted the floorboards in gold. Private Karl Weber blinked against it, half expecting to wake to the shout of a German sergeant, the whistle of orders, the roar of war. Instead, he heard birds, and the distant sound of a radio playing music, not martial anthems, but something light, filled with horns and laughter. He lay still for a long moment, staring at the ceiling beams. Sunlight crept slowly across the plank above his bed, marking the start of his first full day in captivity and the first day of peace he'd known in years. When the morning bell rang, he rose automatically. The barrack came alive with motion. Boots scraping the floor, metal cups clanging, murmured prayers. Men buttoned their uniforms, not field gray tunics, but plain denim work clothes issued by the Americans. Each had a large white PW stenciled across the back. Prisoner of war. Karl touched the letters on his chest. They felt strange, humiliating, and freeing at once. Outside, the air was cool, heavy with dew. Beyond the barbed wire fences, fields rolled into the horizon, green, endless, alive. It was hard to believe he was still a prisoner when he could see so much open sky. The guards watched from their towers, rifles slung casually, not aimed. Most of them were young, their faces brown from the sun. They didn't shout or threaten. They simply existed steady, present, human. A loudspeaker crackled, followed by a cheerful southern voice. "Good morning, gentlemen. Breakfast at the mess in 15 minutes. Line up by barracks. Remember, no running, no fighting, no foolishness." Otto groaned from behind Karl. "They call us gentlemen now. Maybe we died after all." Karl smiled faintly. "Then hell has better coffee than I expected." When they reached the mess hall, the smell hit first bacon, fresh bread, real coffee. It was a small miracle that made the men exchange wary looks. The last meal Karl had eaten under German command was cold tinned meat and a dry crust of bread. Here, steaming plates waited on long wooden tables. The American cook behind the counter, a round man with a red bandana around his neck, grinned at them. "Morning, boys. Don't be shy now. Grab a tray and keep moving." The Germans obeyed, silent and confused. Karl accepted his plate eggs, potatoes, bread, thick with butter, and sat among his comrades. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, one by one, they began to eat. Otto whispered, "If this is propaganda, it's working." Across the table, an older prisoner named Feldman muttered, "Don't be fooled. They're fattening us before interrogation." Karl took another bite. "Then let them fatten us. It's the first time I've eaten like a man in 2 years." After breakfast, a guard led them to the main yard for orientation. The camp commandant stood waiting, a tall man with gray hair and calm eyes, his uniform crisp but unpretentious. Through an interpreter, he addressed the prisoners. "You are now under the care of the United States Army. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will work. You will receive pay. You will have medical care and recreation. You will also be expected to obey all rules." The interpreter paused, glancing at his notes. "Breaking rules will result in confinement. Cooperation will result in privileges." Someone in the crowd laughed bitterly. The commandant ignored it. "The war may continue elsewhere, but here it is over. You are soldiers, not criminals. Act accordingly, and you'll be treated as men." It was not the speech Karl expected. He had imagined humiliation lectures about Nazi crimes, endless interrogations. Instead, the Americans spoke as if they were equals stripped of circumstance. Later that morning, the prisoners were divided into work groups. Karl's detail was assigned to a nearby farm owned by a man named Henry Miles, a broad-shouldered Texan with sun-cracked skin and a cigarette always hanging from his mouth. 2 guards accompanied them, but their rifles stayed slung. The truck ride to the farm took 20 minutes along dusty roads lined with wildflowers and fences. The horizon shimmered in the heat, but the land was rich, a patchwork of fields, barns, and cattle. Miles greeted them with a nod. "So you're my new hands," he said through the interpreter. "You work, you get lunch. You work well, you get pie." The Germans exchanged uncertain glances. Pie? It sounded absurdly generous. They spent the morning mending fences and hauling hay. The work was hard but simple, a rhythm that made sense after the chaos of battle. Karl found himself breathing evenly for the first time in months. No shouting officers, no exploding shells, only the creak of wood and the distant lowing of cows. Around noon, Mrs. Miles appeared, a plump woman in a floral dress carrying pitchers of lemonade. She poured for the guards. Then, to everyone's astonishment, for the prisoners as well. Karl hesitated before taking the glass. "Danke," he murmured. She smiled politely. "You're welcome, honey." The word honey startled him, a softness he hadn't heard directed at him since childhood. After they finished work, the prisoners were loaded back onto the truck. As it rumbled through the countryside, Karl watched the farm slide past. Every house looked clean, untouched by war. It was as if another planet had grown quietly, while Europe tore itself apart. Back at camp, the guards checked their numbers, then dismissed them to the recreation field. There, prisoners played soccer using a makeshift ball of rags. Others sat under trees sketching or writing letters. Someone strummed a harmonica, the notes drifting lazily through the air. Karl joined Otto on the sidelines. "They let us play?" Otto shrugged. "Maybe they want to see if we run for the fence." Karl glanced at the fence, tall, barbed, guarded by towers. But beyond it stretched nothing but miles of open land and a language they didn't speak. Escape was pointless. For now, freedom meant breathing without fear. As the sun set, painting the sky orange, a convoy of trucks passed on the distant road, carrying supplies. One of the guards, a lanky boy, barely older than Karl, leaned against the fence, watching. "You know," he said, "most of those trucks are going to feed your folks back home." Karl turned to him. "Feed? You mean Germany?" "Yep. After the war's over, we'll be sending food there. Crazy, huh? Fight a man one day, feed him the next." Karl didn't know how to respond. In his world, enemies didn't share bread. That night, after dinner, the camp commandant visited the barracks. "Tomorrow," he announced, "you'll be allowed to send letters, 1 page per man. Keep it personal, not political." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Karl sat at his bunk later, staring at the blank sheet the guard had handed him. What could he say? That he was safe? That the Americans treated him like a human being? His mother wouldn't believe it. Finally, he wrote, "Dear Mother, I am alive. The war has taken me far, farther than I ever dreamed. I am in a land where the sky never ends and the people smile even when they don't know you. I think of home every day. Tell Anna I still carry her photo. Tell her I've seen a world bigger than hate." He paused, then added a final line. "Maybe peace is not a place, but a way of being alive." He folded the letter carefully and handed it to the guard at lights out. Sleep came slow that night. Karl lay listening to the hum of insects, the soft snoring of men, the faint music drifting from the guards' quarters, a tune played on a harmonica. The melody sounded like freedom disguised as sorrow. In his dreams, he saw his mother opening the letter, her hands trembling, tears on her face. He saw his sister laughing in a garden untouched by bombs. He saw himself walking through endless fields beneath an American sky. Morning came again, hot, bright, alive. The prisoners lined up for roll call, saluting out of habit though no one required it. The guards nodded back, amused. After breakfast, the Americans handed out newspapers, Stars and Stripes, printed in English but illustrated with photographs. One image showed Allied troops landing in France, Another showed prisoners rebuilding bridges. There were no boasts, no slogans, just facts. Karl studied the faces in the photos. Even in victory, the Americans looked tired, human. It unsettled him. He had imagined arrogance. Instead, he found weary mercy. At lunch, Frank Carter, the same sailor who had guarded them on the ship, appeared at the gate. He had been transferred to camp duty. When he saw Karl, he grinned. "Well, look at that. I told you you'd get cows and corn." Karl laughed despite himself. "And pie," he added. "Don't forget pie." They shook hands through the fence, an act that broke rules neither cared about. For a moment, two young men who had been enemies stood as equals in the warmth of a Texas sun. That evening, as twilight settled over the camp, the prisoners gathered near the fence to watch the sunset. It bled across the sky like watercolor, fading from gold to crimson to indigo. Otto exhaled slowly. "If home ever looks like this, I'll never leave again." Karl nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Maybe this is what the world looks like when it stops fighting. Behind them, the American flag fluttered quietly in the breeze. Its fabric caught the last light, glowing red, white, and blue against the darkening sky. For the first time, Karl didn't see an enemy's banner. He saw a promise that maybe men could build nations without burning others to the ground. When the night bell rang, the camp fell silent. Karl lay in his bunk, watching shadows move across the ceiling. He thought of everything he'd been told about America, that it was greedy, decadent, godless. Yet here he was, fed, alive, treated with a respect he'd never received even from his own officers. He whispered into the darkness, "They lied to us." Otto stirred in the next bunk. "What?" Karl smiled faintly. "Nothing. Just thinking. Maybe the world isn't divided into good and evil after all. Maybe it's just people, trying not to drown." He closed his eyes, listening to the night sounds, crickets, footsteps, distant laughter from the guards' quarters. His first day in America had ended. It had not been a day of chains or punishment. It had been a day of awakening. And as he drifted towards sleep, Karl realized that for the first time since the war began, he wasn't dreaming of escape. He was dreaming of understanding. By autumn, the Texas sun had softened. The heat no longer burned. It simply lingered heavy, constant, like the memory of fire that wouldn't fade. For the men behind the wire, life had settled into a strange rhythm, not freedom, not captivity, something between. Every morning began with roll call. The prisoners lined up neatly outside their barracks as the American guards marked names on clipboards. The guards rarely shouted now. They didn't need to. Order had become habit, born not from fear but routine. After breakfast, work crews departed for nearby farms, sawmills, and construction sites. The Americans paid them 30 cents a day in camp script paper money, redeemable only within the fences. Some bought cigarettes. Others saved for the small camp store, where soap, chocolate, and postcards were sold. Private Karl Weber spent his days at the lumber yard 2 miles north of the camp. The air there smelled of resin and sawdust, not blood and gunpowder. He worked alongside half a dozen fellow prisoners and 3 American civilians, all older men with hands like tree bark and hearts tougher still. They didn't speak German, but gestures were enough. One of them, a burly man named Jack Hanley, always greeted Karl the same way. "Mornin', Fritz! Don't cut your fingers, you hear?" Karl would nod. "No fingers," he'd reply in broken English, grinning. Jack laughed every time. Over the weeks, they began exchanging small words, trading cigarettes and jokes. Karl learned phrases like "good job," "lunch break," and "damn heat." Jack taught him to whistle American tunes, and Karl taught him a slow German song about rivers. Once, during a rest, Jack looked at him curiously. "You got folks back home?" Karl nodded. "Mother. Sister. Bet they're worrying about you." "Yes." He hesitated, then asked, "You? Family?" Jack's smile faded. "Lost my boy in France, June 44. Silence settled between them. heavy and respectful. Karl didn't know what to say. Finally, he said softly, "I am sorry." Jack nodded. "Me too, kid. Me too." That night, Karl sat by the barrack window long after lights out, staring at the stars. He wondered how many fathers sat under the same sky mourning sons who would never come home. German, American, Russian, it didn't matter. Death spoke every language. Life in the camp was not without tension. There were men who still called themselves loyal to the Führer, who whispered about escape and revenge. They met in corners after dark, their voices low, their eyes hard. To them, kindness was an illusion, a trick by the enemy to make them soft. Karl tried to avoid them. He had seen enough of hate's harvest. But one night, as he returned from the mess hall, two of them stepped from the shadows. Tall, lean men with cold smiles. "You talk too much with the Americans," one said in German. Karl frowned. "I work. I speak. That's all." The other sneered. "That's how it begins. First you work, then you smile, then you forget who you are." He felt a flash of fear, then anger. "Who I am," he said quietly. "A soldier without a war. A man who wants to live. That is who I am." The taller one leaned closer. "You're a disgrace." Karl met his eyes. "No, I'm just tired of dying for lies." They stared at each other for a moment, and for the first time Karl realized the war had not ended for everyone. Some carried it like a wound that refused to heal. Later, he confided in Otto, who sighed. "They'll come around when they see there's no one left to fight for." But Karl wasn't so sure. Ideology was harder to bury than the dead. Weeks passed. The fields beyond the camp turned gold, and rumors drifted through the wire. Allied advances, German cities bombed, generals captured. The camp radio, controlled by the Americans, occasionally played short news segments in English. Even without translation, the prisoners understood enough. The Reich was crumbling. One afternoon, Frank Carter, the sailor-turned-guard, arrived at the lumber site with a truckload of supplies. He handed Karl a folded newspaper. "Thought you might want to see this." Karl opened it. On the front page was a photograph of a city in ruins, columns of smoke, people wandering streets that no longer had names. The headline read, "Allies enter Aachen, first German city falls." He stared at it for a long time. The image didn't look like victory or defeat. It looked like the world ending quietly. That night, he dreamt of his mother's house, the window shattered, the garden trampled, her hands reaching for him through smoke. When he awoke, dawn was just breaking. He sat on his bunk, trembling. Otto stirred beside him. "Another nightmare?" Karl nodded. "Home," he whispered. "It burns." Otto sighed. "Maybe it has to burn before anything new can grow." The camp chaplain, a soft-spoken American priest who spoke some German, began holding Sunday services for anyone who wished to attend. They were not sermons of victory, but of forgiveness. "Every man carries a war inside him," he said once, standing before a row of bowed heads. "Peace begins the moment he chooses to put it down." Karl listened, the words sinking deep. As winter came, the camp transformed. The Americans brought blankets, extra food, even Christmas decorations. They allowed the prisoners to build a small nativity scene near the chapel. On Christmas Eve, the Germans sang Stille Nacht. The guards stopped to listen, some removing their hats. When the song ended, one of them began softly humming Silent Night in English. The two melodies intertwined, the same tune sung in different tongues, echoing under a cold Texas moon. Karl felt tears he hadn't allowed himself since childhood. Days turned to months. Letters began arriving from home, tattered and delayed, but priceless. Karl's mother wrote that their house had been hit by bombs, but she was alive, living with relatives. She ended the letter with, "The world must find its way back to light, my son. Promise me you will too." He carried that letter everywhere, folded in his pocket like a prayer. Spring arrived again, and with it, news. The war in Europe was nearly over. Berlin surrounded. Hitler's name spoken now only in whispers. The camp fell silent the day the announcement came. The commandant gathered the prisoners in the yard. "Gentlemen," he said through the interpreter, "the war in Europe is finished. Germany has surrendered." No one cheered. No one spoke. Some wept openly. Others stood like statues, eyes hollow. Karl felt as if gravity itself had vanished. The thing that had defined his entire life, the cause, the struggle, the fear, was gone. What remained? That night, he walked to the fence and looked out at the fields, glowing under the moon. Frank approached quietly, resting his rifle against the post. "It's over," Karl said, barely a whisper. Frank nodded. "Yeah, about damn time." Karl's throat tightened. "What happens to us now?" "Repatriation, eventually. Some'll go home soon, some later. You boys helped the farmers. They like you. You'll be fine." Karl exhaled, long and slow. "Home," he said again, as if testing the word's meaning. Frank looked at him thoughtfully. "You ever gonna come back?" Karl smiled faintly. "To America?" "Yeah." He hesitated. "Maybe not with a rifle next time." Frank chuckled. "You come back, I'll buy you a beer." They shook hands through the fence one last time. Days later, Allied trucks rolled in, carrying officials and papers. Some prisoners were transferred to other camps. Others prepared for the long journey home. Karl helped pack the barrack, folding blankets, scrubbing floors. He found his first letter to his mother tucked inside his old work jacket, the ink faded, but words still clear. Before leaving, he visited the lumberyard one final time. Jack Hanley was there, hammer in hand, building a new barn door. When he saw Karl, he smiled. "Didn't think you'd leave without saying bye." Karl shook his hand. "Thank you for treating me like a man." Jack nodded. "Ain't no other way to treat one." He pressed something into Karl's hand, a small carved wooden cross. "Made it from Texas pine. Keep it. Remind you there's good folks everywhere." Karl looked down at it, his throat too tight to speak. When the convoy of trucks left the camp, the prisoners stood packed in the back, waving through the dust. Guards and townsfolk waved back. Some smiled, some saluted. As the fences disappeared behind them, Karl realized that what he was leaving wasn't just a camp. It was a lesson carved into his soul. War had shown him how cruel men could be. America had shown him how kind they could be, even to those who didn't deserve it. Fruth, America God have cats. That night, as they camped near the rail station, he lay awake watching the stars again. They looked the same as over Munich, over Africa, over every battlefield he'd survived. But something in him had changed. The stars no longer looked cold. They looked like witnesses, silent, eternal, forgiving. He turned to Otto, who lay beside him staring at the sky. "Do you think the world will ever forget?" Otto shook his head. "Maybe it shouldn't." Karl smiled faintly. "No, but maybe it will forgive." The night breeze carried the distant hum of a train, the one that would take them east, toward home. But in his heart, Karl knew that a part of him would never leave that Texas camp, the place where an enemy had taught him to be human again. The Texas wind carried news faster than the radio. It came in the shouts of guards, in the whispers among prisoners, in the sudden stillness that spread through the camp like a chill. Germany had surrendered. Hitler was dead. The Reich, the empire that was supposed to last 1,000 years, had fallen in 12. Private Karl Weber was chopping wood when the announcement echoed through the loudspeaker. He stopped mid-swing, the axe buried in a log, his hands trembling on the handle. The voice was calm, almost gentle. "Attention all personnel and prisoners. As of May 8, 1945, the German High Command has signed an unconditional surrender. The war in Europe is officially over." For a moment, there was silence, then murmurs, then the sound of a man laughing wild, broken laughter that turned into sobs. Some prisoners dropped to their knees. Others stood frozen. A few shouted prayers. A handful cursed. The air was thick with disbelief. Karl let the axe fall. He stared at the sky blue, endless, untouched by everything that had just died inside him. Otto came running from the barracks, breathless. "It's true," he gasped. "Berlin is gone. The Führer is dead." Karl nodded slowly. "Then so is everything we fought for." That night, the camp was quieter than it had ever been. No laughter from the guards, no music from the radios, just the wind sighing through the wire fences. The Americans lowered their flags to half-mast, not for Germany's defeat, but for the dead of all nations. It was a gesture that none of the prisoners had expected, and it struck them harder than any victory speech could have. In the mess hall, dinner was served as usual, but no one spoke. Men chewed in silence, eyes unfocused, as if food itself had lost meaning. Afterward, the camp commandant assembled them in the yard. He removed his hat and spoke directly, through the interpreter. "Men, your war is over. You have fought, suffered, and endured as soldiers. I will not lecture you about what comes next. You will decide that yourselves. But I will tell you this. Peace is not a gift. It is work, hard work, the kind that begins in the heart." He paused, scanning their faces. "Tomorrow is a new world. Let's not poison it with the old one." He saluted them not mockingly, but with respect. Then he walked away, leaving hundreds of stunned men behind. Karl stood there, motionless. He had expected humiliation, punishment, something dramatic. Instead, he received honor, and it undid him completely. Later that night, he sat outside the barrack, staring at the wooden cross Jack Hanley had carved for him. He turned it in his hands, feeling the grain of the wood, the roughness of kindness made tangible. Frank Carter approached, leaning on the fence. "You heard the news?" Karl nodded. "It feels empty." Frank sighed. "Yeah, endings usually do." Karl looked up. "What happens to us now?" "Well," Frank said, scratching his chin, "some of you'll go home soon. Some'll stay a while. Depends how fast they figure things out over there. Trains, ships, food shortages. The world's a mess, kid." Karl smiled faintly. "The world's always a mess." "True," Frank admitted. "But maybe we can clean up some of it." He tossed Karl a pack of cigarettes. "For the end of the war." Karl caught it, staring at the gift like it was unreal. "Danke." "Don't mention it. You boys ain't the enemy anymore." As Frank walked away, Karl lit a cigarette with trembling hands. The smoke curled upward into the night, soft, fragile, temporary. Days passed. News filtered in through newspapers and the guards' radios. Photographs of destroyed German cities circulated among the prisoners. Hamburg in ruins, Cologne reduced to rubble, Munich barely standing. Karl stared at them until the lines blurred. Somewhere beneath all that dust and stone was his mother's home. Was she alive? Was his sister? He didn't know. He wrote letters that never reached anyone, pouring his soul onto thin paper. "I am alive. I am not who I was. Forgive me for believing lies. Forgive me for surviving." The camp chaplain began holding evening talks for those who wished to attend. He didn't preach. He listened. Men confessed things in broken English, German, even tears. Crimes, regrets, memories. The air in the chapel was heavy with ghosts. Karl spoke once, quietly. "I killed men. I don't remember their faces, but I see their shadows when I close my eyes." The chaplain nodded. "That means you remember your soul." Outside, Texas carried on. The war was over here long before it ended elsewhere. Fields still grew. Children still played. The sound of jazz still floated through the night air. The Americans didn't celebrate loudly. They worked, rebuilt, and lived. The contrast gnawed at the prisoners, a reminder that the enemy had not only defeated them, but surpassed them in grace. Summer came. The camp relaxed its rules. The gates were still guarded, but the guards leaned on their rifles rather than clutching them. Prisoners were allowed to visit nearby towns under supervision to help harvest crops and repair fences. The first time Karl walked into an American town, he expected hatred. Instead, He found curiosity. Children pointed and whispered, "Look, Mama, the German soldiers." Some adults nodded politely. Others ignored them. No one spat. No one shouted. An old man sitting outside a hardware store waved them over. "You boys ever had root beer?" he asked. The interpreter frowned. "Root beer?" The old man chuckled. "Not beer. Sweet drink. Try it." He handed them bottles, cold and fizzing. Karl took a cautious sip. The taste was strange, sugary, earthy, unfamiliar but pleasant. He smiled awkwardly. The old man grinned back. "See? Told you it ain't poison." It was a small thing, but for Karl, it felt like absolution. Weeks passed. Repatriation lists were posted. Men crowded the bulletin board each morning, searching for their names. Some rejoiced. Others despaired when theirs weren't there. Otto's appeared first. He was to leave for Germany within 2 weeks. That night, the two friends sat by the fence, sharing a last cigarette. Otto stared at the glowing tip. "You think we'll recognize home when we see it?" Karl shook his head. "I think home will recognize us first, and it won't like what it sees." They laughed softly, the kind of laughter that hides pain. When Otto's transport left, Karl stood by the gate, watching the truck disappear down the dirt road. Dust rose behind it like smoke, then settled slowly, leaving only silence. He felt lonelier than he ever had on the battlefield. Days stretched into weeks. He worked, wrote, waited. Each sunrise brought the same question: when? One evening, Frank approached him near the mess hall, waving a clipboard. "Looks like your turn, Karl Weber. You're going home." Karl's heart stuttered. "When?" 2 days. He didn't sleep that night. He lay awake, staring at the rafters, listening to the hum of crickets. Home. The word felt both sacred and terrifying. What would he return to? A country in ruins. A family scattered. A name that might carry shame. The morning of departure, the camp assembled to bid farewell to a group of 200 men. The commandant shook hands with each of them. "Go rebuild something," he said, "even if it's just your heart." Karl stood at the back of the truck as it pulled away. The guards saluted. Some of the Americans clapped. Frank grinned, raising his coffee mug. "Don't forget that beer, Fritz," he shouted. Karl laughed through the tears blurring his vision. "I'll hold you to it." As the camp vanished into the distance, he realized he was leaving more than a place. He was leaving a version of himself that no longer fit. The train north carried them through landscapes that looked too peaceful to belong to a world that had just survived a global war. Towns, rivers, endless fields, none of them bombed, none of them broken. At a transfer stop in Street Louis, they were given coffee and sandwiches by volunteers. One young woman smiled as she handed Karl his lunch. "Good luck to you," she said. He wanted to thank her, but words failed. How do you thank someone for seeing your humanity when you no longer recognize it yourself? When their ship finally left the American port, Karl stood at the railing, watching the coastline shrink. The Statue of Liberty rose in the distance, pale and immense against the morning mist. He whispered softly, "You are not my nation, but you gave me my soul back." The voyage home was quiet. No songs, no speeches, just men staring at the sea, wondering what waited on the other side. One evening, Otto's voice echoed in his memory. Maybe home won't like what it sees. Karl feared he might be right. But beneath that fear was something stronger, a promise made to himself under the Texas sun, to live as proof that kindness could survive even war. When Europe's ruined coastline finally appeared on the horizon, the men pressed against the rails. The smell of salt and smoke mixed with something older sorrow. Karl gripped the wooden cross in his pocket and whispered a prayer. Not for victory, not for forgiveness, just for peace that could last longer than a moment. The ship docked at Bremerhaven under a gray, merciless sky. It was June 1946, and Germany looked nothing like the country Karl Weber had left. He stood on deck among hundreds of returning prisoners, their American-issued coats fluttering in the cold wind. No one cheered, no one sang. The cranes that once unloaded cargo now stood twisted and blackened, skeletons against the morning fog. The air smelled of rust and smoke, the lingering scent of a war that refused to end, even after the guns had gone silent. A British officer greeted them at the pier, clipboard in hand. "Welcome home," he said dryly, as if the words themselves tasted bitter. They were given meager rations, papers, and a direction. South. Find your families, if they're still alive. Karl slung his small pack over his shoulder and began to walk. The road stretched endlessly, lined with ruins. What had once been villages were now shells of brick and ash. Children with hollow eyes watched from doorways. Old women sifted through rubble with bare hands, searching for memories that no longer had shape. For days, Karl walked alone, trading bits of American chocolate for bread, sleeping in barns, drinking from rivers. Every town looked the same, quiet, broken, waiting. When he finally reached Munich, the city of his birth, his heart clenched. Streets he'd known since childhood were unrecognizable piles of stone, twisted tram rails, facades pockmarked with holes. The cathedral still stood, miraculously, its bells silent but intact. He found the address scrawled on the letter his mother had sent from months before a small village outside the city. He walked the last miles trembling. Each turn of the road brought both hope and terror. At last, he saw a farmhouse, patched together with salvaged wood, smoke curling from the chimney. A figure bent over a small garden. "Moody," he whispered. The woman looked up, hand shading her eyes. Then she froze. Her trowel fell to the ground. "Karl?" He dropped his pack and ran to her. She caught him in her arms, sobbing into his shoulder. Her hair was grayer, her frame thinner, but her embrace was the same. "You came back," she cried. "They said you might be dead, that you were in America." "I was," he said softly, "and now I'm here." They stood there a long time, holding each other as the wind moved through the grass. Inside the house, the smell of soup filled the air. His sister Anna entered, her face thin but her eyes bright. She stared for a heartbeat, then threw her arms around him. "I knew it! I told her you'd come back." Karl laughed through tears. "I almost didn't believe it myself." They ate slowly, talking between silences. His mother told him how the city had burned, how neighbors vanished, how the Americans now occupied the South. "They bring food," she said, "and rules, but no hatred. It's strange, Karl. We lost the war, yet for the first time, we are not afraid." He nodded. "They were kind to us, too." His mother looked at him sharply. "Kind? The Americans?" "Yes," he said simply. "Kinder than our own officers ever were." She studied his face, then smiled sadly. "Then perhaps God sent you across the ocean to learn mercy." That night, Karl lay in the small attic room where he had slept as a boy. Moonlight spilled through the broken window onto the old wooden floor. He took out Jack Hanley's cross and placed it beside his bed. Next to it, he laid the last cigarette Frank had given him, unopened, unlit, a promise still waiting. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since the war began, he slept without dreams. Weeks passed. Germany was trying to breathe again. Allied trucks rolled through the streets, delivering supplies. Posters urged citizens to rebuild, to start anew. The Nazi flags were gone, the swastikas chiseled from stone. What replaced them was quieter hunger, humility, survival. Karl helped where he could. He joined a reconstruction crew, repairing bridges and roads, working alongside British soldiers and German civilians. Sometimes, when he passed through towns, he saw former soldiers begging for food, men still trapped in the war inside their own minds. He shared what little he had, though some spat at him for wearing an American coat. "Traitor," they hissed, "you ate their food." He didn't answer. He had learned that silence was stronger than pride. One day, while unloading bricks near the train station, he met a journalist, a young woman taking notes for the Allied newspaper. She asked for his name, his story. When he told her he'd been a prisoner in Texas, she raised her eyebrows. Texas? She said. You make it sound like a vacation. Karl smiled faintly. In some ways, it was. I learned how to be human again. She studied him for a moment, then wrote something down. Maybe that's the story the world needs now. By winter, his small village had rebuilt its church. The first Christmas after the war, the bell rang again, cracked, but still singing. During the midnight service, Karl stood among neighbors who once might have turned him in for dissent. Now they stood shoulder to shoulder, heads bowed. When the choir began to sing Stille Nacht, his throat tightened, the same song he had sung behind barbed wire under a Texas sky. He could almost hear the American guards humming along. After the service, he walked home through the snow. The stars above were cold, brilliant, infinite. He remembered what the chaplain had said. Peace begins the moment a man chooses to put his war down. He stopped in the middle of the road and whispered, "I'm putting it down." His breath hung in the air like smoke, then disappeared. Years passed. Germany changed. Children played where ruins once stood. The American occupation turned into alliance. Roads were rebuilt. Schools reopened. The world moved forward, and Karl moved with it. Slowly, cautiously, carrying his lessons, like sacred stones. He never forgot the faces from the camp: Otto, Jack, Frank. Sometimes he wrote letters to the Red Cross, hoping they could find his American friends. None ever reached him, but he kept writing anyway. In 1955, 10 years after the surrender, Karl received an envelope postmarked from the United States. Inside was a photograph, a man standing beside a pickup truck, smiling broadly. On the back was written, "Still waiting on that beer, Frank Carter, Texas." Karl laughed out loud, tears blurring his vision. He pinned the photo to his wall beside the wooden cross. That night, he poured himself a small glass of beer, warm, flat, German, and raised it toward the picture. "To you, my friend," he said softly. "You taught me that mercy is stronger than victory." By the 1960 Karl had a family of his own, 2 children, a small carpentry shop, and a quiet life in the same village that had once been rubble. On summer evenings, he would sit by the window, telling stories to his son and daughter, not of battles, but of people. He told them about the ship that crossed the ocean, about the farmer's wife who brought lemonade, about the guard who shared cigarettes, about Christmas songs sung in 2 languages. "Were they really your enemies?" his daughter once asked. Karl smiled. "They were soldiers. But enemies? No. War made us that. Peace made us friends." He didn't tell them everything. Not the nightmares. Not the guilt. Some stories were meant to stay in the past, but he made sure they understood one truth, that humanity was not a nationality. In the winter of 1975, Karl returned to America for the first time. He was 55, grayer, slower, but his heart raced like a young man's as the plane descended over Texas. He rented a car and drove for hours through endless plains until he reached a small town. The camp was gone, now replaced by fields and a memorial stone, engraved with simple words, "To the men who came as enemies and left as friends." He stood before it, his hat in his hands, the wind stirring the grass. "You kept your promise, Frank," he whispered. From the nearby farmhouse, a familiar figure emerged, older but unmistakable. Frank Carter. They stared at each other for a long moment, then embraced, laughing and crying like brothers. "You made it back," Frank said, voice thick with emotion. "I told you I'd come for that beer," Karl replied. They sat on the porch for hours, drinking cold bottles under the setting sun. The land looked the same, vast, open, forgiving. When the first stars appeared, Karl said quietly, "I used to think this place was a miracle. Now I know it was just people being good when they didn't have to be." Frank nodded. "That's all a miracle ever is." They raised their bottles one last time, to the past, to mercy, to memory. Years later, when Karl passed away peacefully in his sleep, his children found his belongings carefully arranged on his desk: the wooden cross, the photo of Frank, and a small folded paper labeled "My First Day in America." It wasn't a confession. It was a story written in careful German, then translated into English beneath. It ended with these words: "They took my rifle. They took my uniform. They even took my freedom. But they gave me back my soul. And that is why I will never forget my first day in America."